With the flick of her pen, she writes.
Chapter 19, Portland, Oregon. Billy rose from the forest floor and made his way back to the mansion. He had left a small part of himself out there with the fairy, and he knew that he might not get that part back again. He had so wanted to go with her. The feeling in his heart and soul was light and free, but he had deeper things on his mind that he was considering. How in the world was he going to find Larimar? She had said she was coming to find him, but what did that really mean? And what would he do if he did find her? So many unanswered questions ran through his mind. It was definitely late now, and he was tired from the goings-on of the last few days. What had started as an exciting time with a friend had ended quite surreal and ethereal, and his head was spinning from having spent too much time with the spirit world. He needed to get grounded. He ran a salt bath in the large whirlpool tub and pulled out his favorite crystal, a large Lemurian, and placed it on the edge of the tub. He put some binaural beats on the stereo and plunged naked and unafraid into the tub. He wasn't afraid of meeting Larimar. He just couldn't fathom what was supposed to happen after they met. Did he sweep her up in his arms and they walked into the sunset together? He quite frankly didn't think it would be that easy. He had touched and held a ring in his hand. It had suddenly appeared there after she had pulled him away from the fairy. What was that ring? Who had given it to her? She seemed somewhat taken aback to see him holding it. And how in the world had it come from her hand into his? He had no answers and too many questions, so he settled back into the salted water and allowed his mind to float away with the steam and the music touching his senses. He could travel too, yet he hadn't wanted to since he had first done so as a teenager. He allowed his spirit guides to lead him as he floated and succumbed to the water and the sounds. He awoke with a start and the fleeting feeling that it was time to go home, time to go back to the Oregon coast. In his travels, he had seen himself on the beach, a proposal rock, and he was picking up something off the sand. It was then that he had looked up and seen someone waving at him in the distance. The rest was fuzzy, but one thing was certain. He needed to catch the next flight to Portland. Larimar left the ladies' room feeling so high on life. She had finally told him how she felt, and he had responded to her too. No more just standing there watching each other from afar. They were communicating now. She was ecstatic, but at the same time, she felt bad for her and Rowan. What was to become of them? She found him sitting in the picnic court with a beer and a sandwich. "It's almost time to get boarded," he said. "We should get through security and to our gate," he said, looking up at her, and she did seem better, so that eased her anxiety about her well-being. "How are you feeling?" he said. "I'm good," she said. "Where do we fly to first?" She was curious about the trip now, wanting to know every detail, and ready to listen in case her spirit guides directed her. "Well, it's non-stop, so we'll have to change flights in New York City, but from there we go straight to Portland, and then I've rented a car to take us to my house on the coast," he said, getting excited that this vacation was finally getting underway. "Wow, Portland," she said. "I've never been to the U.S. before," she said, feeling excited yet scared to be leaving her homeland. She realized, though, knowing that this trip was divinely guided and all, all she really needed to do was show up. She let herself relax and even reached down and took a sip of Rowan's beer, smiling down at him. She really wanted them to have a good time on this trip. She really did care for him. "When do we get there?" she asked, innocent to the fact that all the details had been prearranged by angels and guides who only had everyone's highest and best good in mind and heart. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Let's go, darling," he said, standing and taking her arm in a gesture of gentlemanly affection. She allowed herself to be led in more ways than one, and the power and love of a sight unseen took over and led them both to the next chapter in their young lives. Time was moving, yet seemed to be standing still at the same time, and before she knew it, they were seated in first class on the plane with a glass of champagne and some heated appetizers in front of them. "To us and our love," he said, lifting his glass to toast. "To us," she said, Not really clear which us she really had in mind as Billy's face flashed before her. The flight to New York was uneventful and even fun. The flight crew served a delicious meal, and there were movies and music and a fun crowd around them. True to Rowan style, he even tried to get her into the restroom with him for a little mile-high action, but she didn't want to be that obvious, so he had to take a much-needed rain check. That didn't stop him from going into the men's room himself and getting his pleasure on. He didn't need two to tango, although it always felt better that way. He couldn't stop thinking about the young flight attendant who had served his dinner and brushed her thigh against his quite unassumingly. He did have that effect on women. They sensed and felt his sexuality, and that could often get him into trouble. But he had committed himself to Larimar, and that was that. When he returned to his seat, she was asleep, and so he turned his attention to a movie and counted the hours to Portland. Billy awoke in the morning with a huge headache. Too much of everything the day before, he recalled. He had one objective, and that was to get on the next flight. He had been at the mansion now for several months, and so he had a lot of packing to do. With his flight booked, he turned his attention to cleaning up and eating breakfast. He had quickly forgotten that he was supposed to touch base with Chandra, but he quite frankly didn't want to relive what had happened between them, and his heart just wasn't quite in it. He felt flat in that regard. He kept feeling the tug to get packing and get moving. His flight was at 1 p.m. and he didn't want to miss it. He sent a text letting his friend know he was leaving the house and thanking him for his hospitality. He'd had a boss time there, and he knew the whole place was magical and inspiring. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be back, but he wanted to instill his gratitude for this day. So he cleaned up and left everything better than he found it. He also left some money on the decanter by the bar and some mushrooms in the fridge. He found a small bottle of some tonic he had made at the last solstice, and he left it with a note on how best to use it. Yes, he had been blessed by this space in more ways than he could ever know, and now Portland called, almost beckoned him there. So he must heed that call. He sent a text to Chandra, letting her know he was leaving. He knew it was a chump move, not talking to her, but he felt that everything would eventually be fine between them. It just needed time. And now was not that time to talk about everything that had happened. It was time to go home and to Larimar. And with that, he put his bags in the Firebird and headed to the airport. He didn't have time to make the drive back home. He had felt the insistence to get going quickly, so he would leave the car in long term and come back for it another time. It wasn't going anywhere. Portland, here I come. Larimar, here I come to you, he thought as he neared the airport. And his guide smiled and cheered behind the veil as he was following their guidance without delay. All was going according to divine plan. Chapter 20. A divine flashback. Chandra heard her phone text notification, picked her cell up to Billy's text. What in the world, she thought to herself. I'm supposed to help him with this one. But since the dragon skull healing, she was beginning to feel like maybe that wasn't supposed to be so. She felt like she too needed to return home and talk to Sky. Really talk to him. She kept thinking about how much she really needed him and how he was there for her when she needed him. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he was a loving partner, and he supported her work and her world. He just wasn't that good at doing his own personal work. She had some decisions to make about her future, and it involved Sky and Soul Step and her own feelings. It was her life most important of all, and if she wasn't happy in it, then it was her duty to it was her duty to herself to make it right. Yes, by golly. She needed to love herself first and let everything else fan out from there. She dialed Sky and waited as his cell rang. She was going home. Shamrock Airlines Flight 101 landed in Portland at a little 5:30 p.m. A jet-lagged Larimar and Rowan emerged from the first-class cabin feeling like they had traveled way further than the thousands of miles across land and sea. They needed to rest and catch up with their new time zone. They may not make it to the sea later that day as Rowan had planned. He decided instead to book a hotel room and stay the night downtown. Larimar was slightly relieved as she didn't fancy a long car drive, especially in the winter weather that seemed to be swirling around as they disembarked the plane. Rather than pick up the rental car, Rowan booked an Uber to take them to the most expensive hotel in Portland. He booked a suite and had the concierge bring in a sumptuous and expensive dinner. All was waiting for them when they arrived, and they placed their bags at the door. They were even too tired to change clothes. They dropped onto the large Cali King bed, and Rowan poured the already chilled champagne and handed Larimar a glass. She drank deeply and plopped a huge chocolate-covered strawberry in her mouth, savoring the juice as it dripped down her chin. Rowan leaned in to kiss it off, and thus began the evening of love-making, laughter, and other surprises he had up his sleeve for their time together. The drinks had kick-started his libido, and Larimar, for some reason, was especially turned on herself. He could and did have that effect over her. Late into the evening, they bathed in the large whirlpool tub, made love in front of the fireplace, and enjoyed each other's company. They fell asleep drunk in wine and pleasure, and it wasn't until the wake-up call came later the next morning that they opened their eyes to sunlight streaming through the lush curtains. "Good morning," Rowan said, kissing her lightly on the forehead. "How did you sleep?" he said, getting up naked to pull open the curtains and expose himself to the city skyline. "Like a dream," she said, languishing over his form. "Thank you for last night. I needed that," she said, referring to the love-making and the companionship, for she had been feeling quite lonely lately, and his caress and caring always made her feel better. "Well, I think today we can head out to the ocean," he said, hoping everything at the house was in order. He had called in the cleaning company and a chef he always used when he was in town. The house was to be filled with all manner of gourmet provisions, and the chef had prepared meals that they only needed to heat and eat. The goal of this vacation was rest, relaxation, and more of the same. For the next 2 weeks, they only had to succumb to the ocean waters and each other. He would do anything she wanted, and he hoped that this would please her. He had something special to speak to her about, but that would come later, when he was absolutely sure. Larimar rose and went to shower in the rainwater bath. She let the warm water drench her completely, and she found herself singing a sweet song she had made up when she was younger. "Let me fly free, whatever that might be, la la la, la 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 la." She sang with abandon, and then in her mind's eye, she saw a plane landing and Billy stepping off the tarmac. Where was he now, she wondered, as she went back to her song. The words made her feel light and free, and she realized she had made this song after the first time she had seen Billy in her dreams all those years ago. She knew that he was someone special, although she had never seen him before in this lifetime. And over the years from that first time, he had visited her in and out of her dreams, sometimes there in front of her, unnoticed, but aware that in her presence was where he wanted to be. And she would go to him in her dreams and stand before him silently, wondering when and if they could speak to each other, but really just quietly admiring him from afar, and knowing deep within her being that she knew this man from somewhere far beyond what her thinking mind could imagine. The phone rang, and she heard Rowan pick up the line. She heard him muttering something about business, and he didn't sound too happy at all. She could overhear his tone becoming agitated, and she knew something was up. She was almost afraid to come out of the bathroom and hear what was going on, but she didn't have to. He came into her. "Darling, something terrible has come up with my business. It's something I can't ignore," he said, sitting down on the edge of the tub. "Damn it all to hell! I have to go home and address this right away, Larimar. It can't wait," he said, knowing he was breaking her heart. "What?" she said incredulously. "They had just gotten here and now they had to leave?" "I want you to stay at the house and wait for me there," he said tensely. "I have to address this in person, Larimar. My whole business hangs in the balance. Some foreign investors are trying to stage a takeover of the company, and I have to be there," he said. "Why now?" "They were just waiting for me to leave to try this," he said, holding his hand up in a fist. "Well, they will not beat Rowan McIntyre," he said with power. She was in shock, but she knew that everything ultimately would go okay. "I can come with you," she said, not knowing how she could really support him. "No, dear, no. I'm taking you to the house, and you're going to stay there and have an amazing time. This won't take long, and then I'll fly back, and we can spend the rest of the time together," he said, looking up at her. He stood and touched her cheek. "Promise me you'll stay. It will all be fine, but I need to show myself and deter these bastards," he said. "No one is getting my company." "Okay, I'll wait there," she said, her pulse quickening. "Where is this house?" she asked. "It's right off the beach at Proposal Rock," he said, picturing the ancient beachhead with the trees that came up out of the sand, and the huge rock face where he planned a special meeting with her as part of his vacation surprise. But all that could wait. He needed to hurry and get her there so he could get back and fly out later tonight. "Let's get going," he said. "It'll take us several hours to get there in this weather. It's sunny here, but the weather report says it's storming closer to the water," he said, leaving her to get ready. "Let's leave as soon as possible," he said, closing the door behind him. And at that, she moved into action, getting ready to get one step closer to the coast and to Billy. She sensed a quickening in her stomach as butterflies of change and transformation flitted around, warning her to impending change.